Matt Lechtenberg is here. He works as the Water Quality Initiative Coordinator for the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship. Matt manages the implementation activities of the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy, and he also serves as the co-chair of the coordinating committee of the Hypoxia Task Force. Matt, thank you for being with us. Just as a reminder, Matt will run about 25 to 30 minutes, and we will take questions for Matt and all of the rest of the presenters throughout the morning. And you can just drop those right there into the chat box, and we'll make sure that they get asked. Matt, good morning to you. Thanks for being with us today.
Good morning, Todd. Thanks for having me. Does everybody hear me all right?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to chat with you guys, our friends to the east. So just want to give a high-level overview of some of the things that we've got going in Iowa, and a lot of the things that you'll be hearing about today are probably see a lot of similarities between us because we're so similar, but maybe some differences, and I'll be glad to answer any questions and clarification to anybody that any of those questions that come up. So jumping right in, a lot of this is going to be overview and review, so I won't spend a lot of time with it. But again, there'll be some similarities. So the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy is taking on the 45% goal in nitrogen and phosphorus, led by the Nonpoint Source section was led on by the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, Point Sources by the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, and then the science aspects of that, primarily the Nonpoint Source was led by Iowa State University. So point source, non-point source working together is very important, but maybe a little bit different in Iowa compared to Illinois is we have a much smaller footprint as opposed for the point sources, for sure, compared to the non-point sources. So taking all of those things into consideration and understanding that our strategy is a dynamic document that will change and has changed since it was released in 2013. So just providing some updates that we've had kind of from the start upon the release of the strategy. Early on, even at the same year that the strategy was released, the Iowa legislature established the Water Quality Initiative. It's the program that I manage through the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship to direct efforts to directly for the nutrient reduction strategy. One of the main focuses that we have done with the Water Quality Initiative is while there's it's important that we have those state investments, and we're fortunate to have those, but we want to be able to maximize those and look at those other sources, whether it's from federal sources or private sources, and our landowners out on the landscape as well. Engaging partners, again, not anything new for you folks in Illinois, but we need to understand where we're at, where we've been, and where we're going, and how does that growth come, and working through these things. Some of the things that we're doing is very new. Some of the technologies that we're doing is very new, like a bioreactor saturated buffer. So there are going to be some barriers that we need to overcome and learn and demonstrate. So that's an important factor. I'll kind of illustrate some of that in my talks here today too. But also make sure that we're doing a better job of being accountable in the whole realm of everything that we're doing, not just what one program does versus another, but looking at that culmination and taking a logic model approach of tracking that through the whole process. So how are inputs changing? Where are those inputs being invested? And then what is that effect having on nutrient loads, both monitoring and the modeling of the performance of those practices. And then a more recent update was additional funding dedicated to water quality, again, both point sources and non-point sources, significant sustainable sources. That was pretty new for us, rather than those annual appropriations like we're used to with a lot of our state funding, having dedicated resources. And that conversation is actually continuing, and more resources are actually being talked about, but nothing official at this point. So the science and the innovation of the strategy was really looking at what our practices are that we can do out on the landscape, and what the corresponding effect of those nutrients have, or sorry, those practices have on nutrient loss reductions. And so again, a lot of this is review, but we look at certain practices have an effect on certain nutrients. Some do a really good job of nitrogen, while some only do a good have an effect on phosphorus. And then there's a whole range in what their effectiveness is year in and year out. And then they're categorized by infield management practices, so things that need to be done annually to have that effect, land use change, or rotation changes, and then those edge of field practices that we'll talk about as well, but also on the phosphorus side too, and maybe a little bit more traditional look at those. Again, the logic model, what are the things that we can measure that will help inform, not only inform progress, but then also how do we use that information to direct resources and emphasize and follow and identify those gaps and address those things. And so hopefully kind of illustrate some of those things here through that, how we're using this information as well to adapt. When we look at inputs in Iowa, trying to look again collectively of all the sources of funding, still not anywhere near perfect, because there's a lot of other things out there that have a water quality effect, and being able to quantify those. But certainly the public sector programs through FSA, NRCS, and others is a little bit more readily quantifiable. We see a significant investment in largely from the Conservation Reserve Program through those annual payments that landowners and farmers agree to for taking land out of production, and what that effect has. But then also, EQIP, state programs or fit that base program. But so we have an overall picture of what the total investment is, but of course it all comes down to the details of what those practices actually are on the landscape and what their corresponding effects are on nutrients. And there's going to be some differences depending on what those practices are. And many of these are historical practices, so we're not talking about going from 0 to 360 million. Those investments were made previously, so we need to look at the net change in those practices. Are the acres increasing? Are the practices that we're putting in increasing over time, and if they're management practices versus structural practices, and how that all factors in. So trying to take kind of a historical look, the Hypoxia Task Force looked at the 80 to 96 baseline period, and for where those reductions come from. And so we can look at changes through that period based on some of the data that was available at that time that looked at those. So the Census of Ag looks at how tillage has changed over time. We see that acres in reduced tillage has significantly increased from really not many acres to nearly 30% of the row crop production in Iowa is under a no-till system, and then correspondingly you see the reduction in intense tillage over that time period as well. And so kind of in the middle would be more of a conservation tillage system, which would leave more residue on the top. But at the same time, we see land use and intensity of row crop production has increased over that time period as well. So factoring in all of these things and seeing how those trends change over time. We also look at a historical programmatic or public sector investments, and not only that, but certainly private sector landowners in making these investments as well. But we can see, and we've done a statewide remote sensing activity of inventorying what structural practices are out on the landscape, and we see a significant amount of those practices have been installed in our state to reflect, but largely focusing on soil conservation type practices, and really not as so much on nitrogen. And so again, taking these activities to measure and show what's out on the landscape and what the historical aspects of our programs and our emphasis has been, and what that has culminated in, but then also understanding that there could be some gaps and identify those. So that's where this updated baseline assessment comes in. We see when we compare that baseline, we're largely looking at those tillage changes. We see a over 20% decrease in estimated phosphorus loss from our farm fields. But we also see that the intensity of our cropping system has also increased and we also, and largely with some increases in nitrogen inputs from primarily commercial nitrogen, but also some manure sources, and so we see an increase on that as well. So, looking at how, having the dual approach of nitrogen and phosphorus, we can build off of what we've been able to accomplish with the phosphorus reductions in the way that the path that we've followed there, and try to replicate that with some of these new technologies, and really focus our efforts there. So as I mentioned, the Water Quality Initiative kind of looks at where we're at and how we can address and how we can fill in. So, there's two approaches it could have taken. Do we invest more in getting more done on phosphorus when we've already been able to accomplish a lot, or do we look at trying to do some of those new things or focus in some other areas that haven't had the level of investment? And so while we do some of both, we are really focused on nitrogen, just because that's what the reporting is really showing where we need to make those investments. And we really, knowing that, we need to make sure that we advance that understanding and how we deliver those practices, because they're not traditional by any means. And so again, we can use our existing system to kind of understand that, but then also how do we adapt and replicate that in some of these other practices, and then making sure that we document and track that over time, and build off of that system. So the way we've done this is through demonstration projects. So we have priority watersheds that we put projects and resources out into those watersheds to then demonstrate those technologies, strong outreach aspects and then also some additional funding to support installation of these practices. Use these as areas where we can learn on how these practices are being received by landowners in those watersheds. How do we go through the process? If it's an engineered practice, how do we design them? How do we build them? How do we ensure that they're meeting specs? All of those types of things, and helping that expand beyond, even in those watersheds, but then also outside in other parts of the state. The partnerships are an important part. We've had over 250 partners are engaged in these projects from a variety of sectors, whether it's conservation groups, ag groups, or even cities and counties and other levels of government that are interested in engaging in this process. We did have two new groups formed. The Iowa Ag Water Alliance is a partnership of several ag groups that came together and really focusing on bringing in private resources to increase the pace and scale, help address barriers for scaling up these efforts as well. The Iowa Nutrient Research and Education Council. So we have our own NREC, and the name was borrowed from you folks in Illinois. We had a lot of similarities there. So what are some of those new and emerging technologies? How can they get some resources to help understand how these technologies influence nutrient loss? Look at that connection with ag retailers and agronomists and CCAs to help drive nutrient reduction strategy messaging there. And then one of their main goals is to do a better job of engaging and understanding some of the management practices largely done privately that are very hard to capture. And so primarily the 4 R's is what their focus is in there. So they're piloting a survey to help gather that information. So I mentioned the need to address barriers. The Conservation Infrastructure Group was stood up by several partners, primarily led by IDALS and IWA, in focusing on certain sections. So cover crops, how do we, thinking about just even in the last few years, some of the challenges that we've had, whether it's related to crop insurance or seeding dates, seed supplies, all of those things. So how can we work together to kind of address some of these challenges that we've been able to have with cover crops at a small level? So if these are challenges at a small level, if we want to get to scale, they're going to be even harder. So how can we streamline things, looking at those specific things? And similar to the conservation drainage, where cover crops has got a little bit head start with the level of effort because of the alignment in soil health and all the other things that are kind of out there at a broader scale. Conservation drainage is really at the infancy stage. And so again, how do we improve that whole process from ground up, I guess, to building something so that when we try to do these at a much more rapid pace, that we're able to do it at a streamline instead of just spinning our wheels. And then an overall look at the strategy. What are the new things on the horizon that we need to be looking at, keeping an eye there. I haven't done a whole lot of slides for point sources just because my day-to-day is mostly on the non-point sources side. Adam Schneiders with the Iowa Department of Natural Resources is really the lead on point sources, and if he's on, he can certainly do a better job of explaining the point source side. But where we have some interaction with non-point sources is a new effort in Iowa that was led by the Iowa League of Cities from a conservation innovation grant. It's looking at similar to a trading type system, but it's a reduction exchange registry where municipalities can invest in practices in the landscape that have a nutrient reduction, and then potentially use that and integrate that into their permitting for offsets as part of their effort, where they can make strategic investments that are more cost effective for nutrient reduction as part of their efforts in the permit, but still factoring into the overall point source commitment that they're making to measure the influent and effluent levels of nutrients, and coming up with a plan to upgrade those systems if they're deemed affordable. So one of the key aspects and the really interesting aspects that I like to look at with the nitrogen side, so this slide is just looking at performance of nutrients and what those corresponding levels from those practices. There's a lot of key differences in there, just even within this slide. I could spend a lot more time talking about it, but for the department's perspective, when we're looking at making our investments, and focus on practices. Early on, we really focused on cover crops, just because, as you can see, they close that critical gap of when we are more susceptible to nutrient loss between harvest and planting. And so if we can have something green and living out there, we can mitigate for some of those losses, and it also affects nitrogen and phosphorus loss. But one of the challenges is that it is an annual practice, so it needs to be something that is installed and utilized annually. Similarly, nutrient management, we really haven't focused a lot, but there are a lot of public or private sector folks that are emphasizing those 4 R's, and it's probably a better focus area or individuals to be working on that, as opposed to the government giving farmers advice on what they should be doing in field. In my experience, that hasn't been very effective of a way of messaging. So having those most trusted sources, having that conversation, but then being able to track and seeing how those things change is very important. I don't want to diminish the importance of those in-field practices. It's just trying to find out who the best source is to having that advice and working through those things. And then on the other side is land use is obviously has a dramatic effect, but again, it's acre for acre, and it's based on an annual investment. Most of the time, there can be some long-term easements and things, but it's still acre for acre for those reductions. So the new and focused area of what we're trying to work through with a lot of our new funding is to focus on these edge of field practices that affect nitrogen, primarily wetlands, saturated buffers, and bioreactors. This is a little bit outdated because we recently have had multi-purpose Oxbows added to our nutrient reduction strategy as a practice that has had proven nitrogen reductions, and so it fits this same type of idea of keeping the lands that are in production productive, but then being able to mitigate some of those nutrients by strategically placing these practices to remove those nutrients before they reach the streams. And so the advantage of these practices is they're infrastructure based. So it's the only practice up here really that's infrastructure based, and it is affecting more acres than the actual footprint. So a wetland, you can treat 100 acres of cropland for an acre of wetland, and have effective nutrient reduction, saturated buffers, bioreactors, maybe 50 acres per practice, and then Oxbows similarly. So in Iowa, that's very important to have that, because we have will continue to be a productive state, will be an ag state likely. And so we need to have these practices that integrate into that system to have those nutrient reductions and the water quality improvement. And so I talked a little bit about the nutrient management. So measuring those practices, we can see some growth in inhibitor use. This is much like the tillage story. That's a newer technology that wasn't available during that baseline period, and so has a smaller overall effect of about 8% reduction on fall anhydrous. But then in the whole it's only on fall anhydrous that we've been able to document. It certainly goes on in the spring as well. There's a lot of nuance and details there, but measuring those things, it's not something that public sector largely invests in. So having that INREC survey is an important component of seeing that trend over time. Nutrient application timing, again, putting in spring versus fall or doing in-season side dress, those types of things is something that the INREC survey is providing, where it shows about 50% of the nitrogen in the 2019 crop year was put on in the spring. And so seeing how those trends change over time is an important factor, and certainly the weather can play a major role in some of these swings that we see over time. And then also the rate, again, is important in seeing that trend over time, but then also showing that distribution when we factor in all of those things between our rotations that cover our state. I mentioned cover crops. I think everybody understands the benefits there, but again, illustrating our cost share investments, we see how we can track how those change over time and the amount of acres that they affect. But then we know that there's private investment in those practices as well for farmers that have seen the value and the soil health benefits, or livestock producers have been able to use that as an economic driver for additional forage for their livestock. And so measuring that change over time, if public sector investment in those practices don't dramatically change through current levels, then that needs to be driven by outside sources, however that is. And so being an important component to track and see that change over time. And there's several sources that can estimate those, and so see those listed there, but just want to illustrate the difference there. Bioreactors been talked about. This is one of those things one of the suites of practices that we're trying to emphasize here in the department with the things and the investments that we're making. Saturated buffers as well, a newer technology. The way that we kind of handle this is that we prefer to focus on saturated buffers just because of the advantages of having a more long-term life. I don't have to worry about refilling the pit. Integrates in with the CRP buffer strips, and so there's some longevity things and there's some reductions in costs, but those don't fit everywhere. And so oftentimes if a saturated buffer doesn't work for soils or whatever reason, then we look at a bioreactor to fill that gap. So we still look at doing as many of these practices as we can, but it dovetails really nicely together, is what we've been able to see. And so saturated buffers here is another example. And so I mentioned the trajectory, so you can see how some of those investments change over time because there's an emphasis. So if we didn't have the information that we had with the nutrient reduction strategy and what the practices are available, or we measured what the level of those practices were, just taking this information and understanding how we can be strategic and then make these investments and focus and see that change on the landscape. And so there's a trajectory to this when we have that information and when we can focus and prioritize resources. And so hopefully that continues to grow and factors, this is going to be a major factor of how we administer the programs for the nutrient reduction strategy. But there also has been significant barriers to this as well. We've had challenges with CRP. So we have these filter strips along streams that are great places to put saturated buffers, but then we had a CRP policy that was established before saturated buffers was a practice and wasn't allowed and didn't allow them to be installed. So that took a year or more, and there's still remnants of this, of the challenge of being able to put these practices in that, even though that the policy has shifted to be more flexible in doing that, but and even incentivizing that practice now. So again, going back to the barriers of doing these new technologies, we've got to get that stuff figured out now when we're building 20 a year, and hopefully get up to where we're building hundreds a year. And then wetlands is the last one, major focus, again, more acres that we can treat with this, but there's plenty of complications and challenges to doing this, whether it's site features, land ownership, but then also really some of the permitting challenges, the designs, land, all of those things kind of culminating together. But ancillary benefits are big with wetlands too, with wildlife habitat and those types of things. And so again, tracking that over time shows that, the number of sites that we install over time, but then the acres treated continues to grow because we don't have to put those practices in year after year. They do their job, and they're going to last a long time. And we're really trying to be more creative and expand the opportunities for wetlands. So what we've done traditionally in Iowa is focused on breakpoint sites. That's kind of the bread and butter of the Iowa Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. So we've got about 90 of those sites have been built, but really looking at how we can get more opportunities out there, and not only kind of getting out of our silos of one program, but we really need to grow beyond those programs into other areas and other parts of the state, and those practices or those wetlands can actually look different and be in different landscape positions. So working through a few of those, and testing out these systems and seeing, we tried doing this to fix one or two problems, but then we're pretty good at creating other problems when we start to do some of these new things too. So working through those challenges, and really focused on expanding the opportunity, not trying to pit one, as what we often do in some of our programs, is say one practice is better than the other. So, and this just illustrates the challenges when we start to do these wetlands. This is the flow chart. It's not a cover crop. In talking to hundreds of landowners, it's talking to one or two landowners, and then dealing with all the other things that you need to do, whether it's the design consultant, federal programs. One of our wetlands touches probably at least four federal agencies before we can even get it built. So navigating all of those things is a huge undertaking, and takes 18 to 24 months to go from getting a landowner interested to getting it designed and actually built. And this just illustrates what we're attempting to do, or what the idea is that when we try to, the kind of that purple shows kind of what the number of sites that we could potentially build in a watershed through some of our watershed planning efforts, and where those are distributed in the watershed. But then once we start to do some of these newer things, newer locations that we can put these wetlands, we grow the opportunity that's out there that we really need to have a larger effect on nutrient reductions. And this slide focuses on wetlands, but it's really true for any of the practices that we're doing. So the Iowa CREP is a good example where it's a partnership project. So we have a lot of support, but then it's led primarily out of the state office and the Iowa Department of Agriculture. And so if we really want to grow this, it means more people doing these types of practices, as opposed to one agency or one group of individuals doing that many more, because there's a limited capacity out there. So really opening up the opportunity. So in Iowa, we've got some new projects with a couple of groups that are really looking at that. So the department's willing to give up, the leadership role or the day-to-day work on some of this, because there's only so much that staff can do day in and day out. So we need other groups that are really focused on that. And that's the same for any of our technology. And cover crops is probably the easiest example, where there's a lot more alignment with a lot of other partners that are really interested and want to be a part of cover crops. So trying to replicate those across all of these types of practices and these systems that we're trying to integrate, and really expanding and bringing in additional outsource resources. So at the end of the day, a dollar saved from the department and brought in from another state, or not, sorry, another state, but from federal sources or private sources, means just end of the day, we get more sites done. And that's all I've got. So happy to take any questions.
And we have many of them for you. Let's get started with some of those questions, Matt. The first one is, what percentage of pee do you believe originates with livestock feeding operations in your state?
Great question. I don't know that I can answer that. I know there's been some estimates that about, I think about, this might be nitrogen. It's probably better if I don't answer it, but I know some of the estimates were based on livestock numbers, animal units. It's about 25% of our nutrient sources are coming from manure. I think Iowa State put that out, but don't quote me of whether that's nitrogen or phosphorus.
Do you know what revenue source is Iowa using for the $270 million investment in your water quality initiative?
Yeah, so it was a couple different things. It was the excise tax for water. A portion of that was invested into that $270 million, so that was redirected to that. But then also there was a retirement of another program, some bonding funds that was ending, and so they redirected those dollars to that fund as well.
And we'll just go straight down the list here. Is there a similar remote sensing effort underway to try to identify and map non-structural infield practices across Iowa?
I'm aware of several groups that are working on those. I think Optus is probably the one that may be most familiar. That's through the Conservation Technology Innovation Center out of Indiana. They've been working with TNC and others to develop a methodology. I know Iowa State has been working on something similar. And so we're aware of those. We haven't integrated those aspects into the reporting at all at this point, but it's something that we're aware of is being worked on.
Do you have any way to track improvements in soil health in the state?
I know that there's a lot of emphasis on that with soil sampling and things in the Soil Health Partnership, some of the Haney tests and things like that, but I'm not aware of anything outside of those or at a much larger scale.
And somebody wants to know what the temperature requirements for fall applied anhydrous nitrogen, anhydrous ammonia might be in Iowa.
I think it's 50 degrees and trending lower.
Right. Usually in the state of Illinois, it's 50 with an inhibitor and 40 without. I'm positive about that. So I suspect those hold pretty closely across the Midwest. Is there any thought in your strategy given to prevention versus treating symptoms? This person goes on to write, we struggle with treatment BMPs only working as well as they're maintained, and that operational and management costs / negligence can quickly balloon beyond the capacity or resources available to keep them functioning. So the question is there thought in your strategy given to prevention rather than treating the symptom?
Yeah, so that's a long discussion. So I think the strategy is based on having the whole system. So you have the infield practices, you have the edge of field practices, you have the land use. So there's ways you can touch on all of those, and so the idea is to do the best infield management, and then even with that, I guess I'm. My interpretation is that that's what we're calling as prevention. Even in Iowa, even if we do the best infield fertility, we're going to have significant losses, especially when our goals are 45% reduction. So we really need to have all of those practices working together in concert. But then it's at the end of the day, it's what we prioritize our resources, what figure or what makes the most sense for public sector investments, those types of things is kind of what we weigh and how we accomplish that at the end of the day. Many of our edge of field practices, we try to do passive And so there isn't a whole lot of maintenance. And so things like wetlands and oxbows and those types of practices, there's maintenance to maintain the buffer and the structure and all those types of things, but it doesn't really affect, you don't have to go out there and manipulate water levels every other day or, even, every month or even every year. It's kind of it just integrates in the practice and it just works year in and year out. Certainly there's changes based on, how much it, comes and when it comes and all those things that factor into the actual performance, but it's not such a maintenance thing. Saturated buffers, you can certainly do as much management as you want. But again, we try to prioritize where it's kind of a set it, forget it, because we don't want a situation where there's going to be a whole lot of management on individual landowners to go and do that because of those challenges, because you're going to, then you have to worry about whether it is being managed or anything like that. So that's a roundabout way of addressing it. I don't know if I took it head on, but that's how we kind of think about it.
How do you go about acquiring the wetlands? Is it easements or something else?
Yeah, so we've tried to do, or I guess I don't say try, we do easements on all of our wetlands. And again, going back to the barriers, that has, that's an additional layer of complexity and admin requirements and something that a landowner needs to consider. But, we've really tried to focus and keep that a part of it just because we get the longevity. So many of these practices or these wetlands are really capital intensive to install. And so we want to make sure that there's going to be long-term assurance that it's going to be there. But, there could be certain situations where we don't do that. But again, just like a CRP practice where you might have a contract for 15 years, that's great for year one. And you're going to have it for 15 years, but then you got to revisit it and come back and say, okay, what's going to happen now when that contract comes up? So, just the whole nature of that, the investment up front to putting an easement, can cut down a lot of the future concern about what happens to those sites. But, there might be situations where it makes sense to not do those just because of the added complication that an easement brings in the future.
Two more questions, and Dave Ball, if you can pull up your presentation now, that would be good. This one on Oxbows, they want to know whether that is how you are incorporating that into the process and in what form it works.
So it's my experience with Oxbows is really new, just because it's been a practice that's been a focus of some groups for several years. So they've got certainly much more experience than I do. But just integrating the programs, I think the way we've tried to look at it is it's very similar to doing a saturated buffer or bioreactor. It's based on the cost share of establishing that practice. The main nuance for the nutrient reduction strategy is there needs to be an external nitrogen source. So if you have an oxbow in a floodplain that is surrounded by a floodplain restoration that's not in cropland, there's probably pretty low nitrogen going into that oxbow, except during those flood years. So we're looking at systems where you have a base flow with some elevated nitrogen coming in primarily from croplands. And so siting is a big factor there, but then, obviously working with the landowners. And so integrating that as part of the portfolio. So much like a saturated buffer, you're going to have to find those locations, those scars where the stream was and have that oxbow there. But then, do you have contributing cropland to it on a baseline, base flow system with an assumed elevated nitrogen level coming in and going through the process that way.
And one last question, Matt, before I let you go. Any estimate on how the derecho, and these happen apparently about every 3 years in your state, may impact farmer participation in cover crops that are seeded this year, or does it have a potential on the nutrient lost from those fields?
Yeah, I kind of, if we get another one of these every 3 years, oh boy, we got a lot of challenges. But so that was a big consideration this year.
But on average, every 3 years, I talked to enough other guys to know what that is. So
we've that was something that we were really curious about. We haven't seen what that's going to look like, but we we were wondering how that affected our programs with cost share and things. That was part of the messaging that, this is a horrible situation for a farmer to be in, but how do we make sure that, that they can be protecting their fields if it's going to leave them more vulnerable to erosion and those types of things, and use it as an opportunity to try to integrate and learn about this system, even though it is unfortunate. We haven't seen, or anything I've seen, that there's how many of those acres were going to be covered with cover crops or anything like that, but we did see more interest in putting cover crops. A lot of questions. It's one thing to be in a system where you harvest and put cover crops in. It's another where you've just had that area devastated by those winds, and then trying to put a cover crop in, or how do you manage it, all those things. So yeah, we've had similar type with prevent plant and those types of questions. So never optimal situations that we want to be in to be answering those questions, but can kind of flip it and have a little bit of opportunity out there to being able to integrate some of these things, and for many of the same reasons of protecting our soil resources, improving water quality. But yeah.
Hey, Matt, thank you. We appreciate you taking the time, spending it with us, and making the presentation for the day.